This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Scientists concerned over delay in rolling out COVID-19 vaccines in Africa. The World Health Organization urges Tanzania to report COVID-19 cases and share data. And Niger votes in presidential runoff to usher in first democratic transition. Welcome to Africa Live on CGTN with me, Beatrice Marshall in Nairobi. Also coming up on the program. In business news, Nigeria adjusts borrowing limits from 25% to 40% of its GDP. And coming up in your sports news, Kenya gears up for the 2021 Africa Cross Country Championship next month. We begin with the very latest on Africa's COVID scenario. Africa has now recorded more than 100,000 coronavirus-related deaths, and there has been concern over the delay in rolling out COVID-19 vaccinations. There has been global competition to get hold of vaccines, and African countries have generally not been as successful as richer countries in securing supplies. Here's CGTN's Wilkis Nyabwa with more details.
While a section of African countries started their COVID-19 vaccine programs in the last month or so, most African nations are yet to begin. Currently, these are the countries which have set the ball rolling. In North Africa, Morocco has started vaccinating its population using AstraZeneca and Sinopharm vaccines. Algeria has turned to Russia's Sputnik V, while Egypt is also using China's Sinopharm vaccine. In sub-Saharan Africa, the countries vaccinating are Seychelles, which is using Sinopharm and AstraZeneca vaccines. Rwanda is reportedly using Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, while Mauritius is rolling out AstraZeneca vaccines. Zimbabwe has turned to Sinopharm vaccines. South Africa, the worst affected country on the continent, delayed vaccination plans over concerns about the efficacy of the AstraZeneca vaccine against a new variant discovered in the country. It has since started using the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which has been shown to be effective against the variant. The country is now offering its 1 million AstraZeneca vaccine doses to the African Union to distribute to other countries. Countries like Senegal and Equatorial Guinea have also received their deliveries of Sinopharm vaccines but have yet to begin administering them. African countries which have secured vaccines have mostly done so through direct purchases from manufacturers or as donations from countries such as China, Russia, India and the United Arab Emirates. The World Health Organization says African countries should begin receiving doses from the COVAX scheme by the end of this month. COVAX is the world's main initiative aimed at supplying COVID-19 vaccines to poorer nations. It aims to provide free COVID-19 vaccines to at least 20% of the populations of the world's 92 poorest countries by the end of 2021.
The emergence of COVID-19 variant...
But John Nkengasong, the head of the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, says the vaccines provided will not get the pandemic out of the continent. To do that, African countries will need to vaccinate at least 60% of their populations. French President Emmanuel Macron is now proposing that rich countries in Europe and the US share their vaccines with Africa. According to the UN, just 10 countries have administered 75% of all vaccinations worldwide. 130 countries have not yet received a single dose. Wilkis Anyabwa, CGTN.
And we earlier spoke to Dr. Githinji Gitahi, the Group CEO, Amref Health Africa, and board member at the Africa CDC. We started by asking him how concerned he is about the delay in rolling out COVID-19 vaccinations on the continent.
It's really worrying because, of course, the world cannot be safe if everyone, including Africa, is not safe. So it's very worrying that parts of the world are being left behind for a pandemic that is contagious in a world that is heavily globalized. The other challenge, obviously, is that when you leave Africa behind for too long and you leave the virus unchecked, then we end up with challenges of mutations and variants that could actually develop, make it more difficult for the world to actually roll out existing vaccines. And finally, obviously, the African economy is dependent on a fully vaccinated population for it to continue unfettered. The challenge really of rollout of vaccines in the continent has been two things. One has been availability of doses, of allocations, because we've seen rich countries, Canada, UK, countries in the European Union, Australia, book doses way beyond their population. Some of them up to 5 times over their own population. And this hoarding and kind of nationalism is affecting availability of doses to Africa. Of course, we've seen African Union try to get a few doses, 270 million to preserve, but Africa has a population of 1.2 million people. 270 doses, you're talking about 130 million people if you assume a 2-dose regime. So Africa is still way behind. We have hope that the COVAX facility, WHO and Gavi will be able to preserve at least for 20% of many countries' populations, but we are still very much behind. So the challenge is, one, is supply chain or availability of doses because of this hoarding by developed countries. And secondly, availability of finances, because if you are to think about a country whose total expenditure on public expenditure on health of its individuals is $20 per capita per year, then that and the cost of vaccination is probably $20 per individual. You can see that you cannot expect that country to shift its entire health budget to vaccination. What happens to essential services? So financing, supply chain, those are the two heavy challenges of access to vaccines in Africa.
Meanwhile, the World Health Organization has renewed calls urging Tanzania to start reporting its COVID-19 cases and share their data. Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus says the organization has yet to receive any information from Tanzania on what measures it is taking to respond to the coronavirus pandemic. On Wednesday, a senior Tanzanian politician died days after being hospitalized with COVID-19 complications. This has added to the concerns about lack of data on the number of COVID-19 cases in the country. Tanzania stopped reporting data on new coronavirus infections and deaths at the end of April last year, when it had registered 509 cases and 21 fatalities. Well, let's cross over to CGTN's Isaac Lukando. He's in Dar es Salaam, joining us live from there. Isaac, so what is the latest on the status of COVID-19 in Tanzania? What do we know about the situation?
So thanks, first of all, for having me. So what we know is that the official stance of the government is that there is no COVID-19 in the country. This has been the case since early June last year. And of course, as you rightly mentioned, the government had stopped reporting cases of COVID-19 in late April 29th to be precise. But recently, the government qualified that statement in a recent interview. The government spokesperson said that Tanzania is not an island, it is not isolated, and because of the interaction that it has with many different countries, there is a possibility of having people with COVID-19 or testing positive for COVID-19 in the country, and as such, it is starting to urge the public to take precaution in that regard.
Well, Isaac, we do understand that a senior Tanzanian official died recently from COVID-19 complications, even though, the scenario is still that there isn't much COVID-19 in Tanzania. How is the government dealing with the situation, though?
So based on the initial statement that there is COVID-19 around the world, and this is quoting the Minister of Health recently, it said that it is aware that COVID-19 has been ravaging many countries around the world, and it is prudent for the country to take precautions. And so recently you have the Ministry of Health giving demonstrations on how, for example, Tanzanians can ramp up their diet to boost their immunity. So you see the Minister of Health and her deputy giving that demonstration. But even more recently, as this week, the president was asking Tanzanians to be careful about the kind of information they were sharing. He gave an example of a minister, to be precise, it's the Minister of Finance who is hospitalized, and there was rumor that he had died, and he was asking the public that to be careful because as he was delivering his speech, he was reading a message in real time from the finance minister, and that such information was a hoax. So he was urging the public to be careful about what kind of information they were sharing. But he acknowledged this week that that there are many diseases, including respiratory diseases, and as such, Tanzanians ought to take precautions. He also urged Tanzanians to rely on divine intervention, and as such, ordered for there to be 3 days of national prayers and fasting from Friday of this week, where on Friday the Muslims would be fasting, Saturday the 7th day Adventists would be fasting, and the rest of the Christian denominations fasting today on Sunday. And so today, the latest that we have is that the President John Magufuli, attended a mass in a Catholic church and addressed the nation, and continued to reiterate that the public ought to be careful and cautious about COVID-19. And as such, wherever possible, especially in public gatherings, should wear masks, but also rely on divine intervention.
All right, Isaac Lukando joining us there from Dar es Salaam. Now, as part of efforts to unite rival Libyan factions, the United Nations Special Envoy for Libya, Jan Kubis, has met with the commander of the eastern-based Libyan National Army, General Khalifa Haftar. At the meeting in Benghazi, Haftar and Kubis agreed that all parties in Libya should work to ensure the elections go ahead as planned on December the 24th. The two also discussed ways to speed up the implementation of the ceasefire agreement, as well as the reopening of a key coastal road linking Tripoli in the west with Benghazi. Well, CGTN's Adel Mahroui is joining us with more from Cairo. Adel, what more can you tell us on the UN envoy John Kubis's visit to Libya?
Well, this is so far has been a 5 days long visit that appears to be wrapping up by the United Nations, which did not specify the duration of the meeting. It started on the 16th of February, where Jan Kubis were accompanied by his coordinator and Assistant Secretary General Radisson Zanega, and humanitarian coordinator for Libya, Georgette Gainan. Both of them, the three, have been touring all Libyan cities. The main purpose was to sit with all newly appointed administration and all stakeholders in Libya to guarantee that there is a coordination. This is his first official visit since he was appointed as special representative for Libya for the Secretary General. Therefore, it could be considered like more of a preparatory meeting. Jan Kubis has started with a big tour. He arrived to Tripoli. He met with Mohammed Sayala, the deputy president to the State Council or Council of State. He then moved on to meet the current Interior Minister Fathi Bashagha, who is part of the Government of National Accord in Tripoli. And the first couple of days were mainly focused on all people who are in charge. So Government of National Accord, including its head and the the current president of the Presidency Council, Faiz al-Sarraj. He then moved east, where he met Aqila Saleh, the Speaker of the Parliament, Khalifa Haftar, the commander and the leader of the Libyan National Army Forces, as well as Mohammed Sayala, the Eastern Foreign Minister, and so on. So that's the general purpose for the visit, is just to meet. And then he continued the last part of his visit, where he started meeting those newly appointed by to be the interim leadership for Libya until the election takes place in December.
So, Adel, this is all part of a series of meetings in efforts to unite the rival Libyan factions. What exactly does the envoy expect to get out of his tour?
Well, I think primarily to be acquainted with the situation in Libya. Jan Kubiš takes responsibility after a major breakthrough that has been led by the United Nations, namely Stephanie Williams, who was acting special representative to Libya. She handed over the Libyan file with an agreement to hold general elections on December 24, with an agreement to hold and maintain a ceasefire, with approval from Libyan factions to welcome UN unarmed monitors, civilian and military experts to maintain the ceasefire along the dividing line in Sirt and Al-Jufra, more or less at the middle of the country. So basically what Jan Kubiš is trying to do is make sure that all files are prepared, that he is more aware, he is introduced to all the stakeholders in Libya, and therefore that might ease the transition in the coming period, where he will be leading himself the talks and following up on the accomplishments that Stephanie Williams handed over to him. And it's mainly why during the last couple of days he was focused to meet with the interim leadership. He has met with Abdelhamid Dbeiba, the interim prime minister, who is currently in rough negotiations to form a unity cabinet. And he has been facing some challenges as the candidates he has been talking with, some of them have clearly stated that they wanted to work in one part of Libya rather than the other, but there is an entire effort and challenge for the interim leadership to form unity, actual unity in terms of leadership and Libyan institutions. Kubiš is there to help with that.
Adil Mahroui joining us there from Cairo. Uncertainty has once again gripped Somalia after clashes erupted on Friday. The opposition has announced that they no longer recognize the country's president after his term ended on the 8th of February. A meeting to end the election fallout was planned for this week, but is yet to take place. CGTN's Abdulaziz Bilo has the latest from Mogadishu.
This was the scene on Friday morning. Protesters blocked the road leading to the main airport. Opposition politicians and presidential candidates led a group of protesters demonstrating against the delayed polls. The Mogadishu International Airport was also hit by multiple rounds of rocket-propelled grenades. Former Prime Minister Hassan Ali Khaire led the protests against the very same man who appointed him.
Before resigning as Prime Minister, I warned against an election that lacks full support and also warned against dictatorship. I didn't want to be part of the problem we are seeing now.
Authorities say armed militias guarding the opposition politicians attacked army positions on Thursday evening, forcing the military to secure the Daljirka Dahson monument. That was the meeting point for protesters. Somali Prime Minister says his government will not tolerate any armed protests.
Every Somali has a constitutional power to protest, but these demonstrations must be peaceful and protected by the government forces. We will not accept any protest that involves people and armed forces opposed to government and state security.
However, the opposition has vowed to launch more protests in the coming days, despite a ban on all public gatherings and rising coronavirus infections.
If peaceful demonstration at Daljirka Dahson was rejected, I doubt if they will accept change of guard at the presidential palace if we cannot demonstrate peacefully.
A planned consultative forum announced by the government on the 18th and 19th February has failed to take place in Mogadishu. Regional states of Jubaland and Puntland that were opposed to the polls have since announced that they will not attend them, citing recent confrontations in the capital. It remains unclear now whether the venue will be shifted. The opposition says the government's mandate has expired and must only serve in a caretaker capacity.
The conflicting parts, again, should come together and also discuss the issue, especially the election, in order to hammer out for the sake of the nation and also for the sake of the posterity. Especially the caretaker government should offer further concessions in order to reach an agreement. So that means each of them should come up with a solution and a sort of challenging, which is quite a zero-sum game.
The United Nations, African Union and regional bloc IGAD have called for urgent talks between federal and regional leaders to end the stalemate and avoid reversing recent security and political progress made in the Horn of African nation. Abdulaziz Bilo, CGTN, Mogadishu. Somalia.
To Niger now, where voters will go to the polls on Sunday to cast their ballot in the second round of the country's presidential elections. None of the 28 candidates won a majority during December's vote. Former Foreign Affairs Minister Mohamed Bazoum from the country's leading party will face off with former President Mahamadou Ousmane. According to the National Independent Electoral Commission, Bazoum won 39% of the vote in round one, while Ousmane won nearly 17%. Niger's President Mahamadou Issoufou will step down after 2 terms, paving the way for the West African nation's first peaceful transfer of power since gaining independence from France in 1960.
Education has allowed me to be where I am. All those who are here have also become leaders because of education. Every citizen should have the chance to study and eventually have a job. Our program aims to reduce youth unemployment because most unemployed young people are vulnerable.
Our program aims to create peace in Niger, a unity of shared development and progress for all citizens of this country.
You're watching Africa Live. Still ahead on the program. Guinea steps up efforts to combat the new Ebola outbreak. And Iran says it is not after nuclear weapons and will study a European Union proposal on the nuclear deal.
Africa is a continent of diversity, with varied climates and enchanting geography, and a people so distinct, but with a shared enduring spirit. We are at the heart of the continent to bring you the untold stories.
Let's have a look.
We celebrate Africa as it shapes its own destiny.
Tunis, Cairo,
Syria,
Juba, Johannesburg, Ethiopia, Tanzania.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
To Guinea now, where health experts have been dispatched to areas where an outbreak of the Ebola virus has been detected. Last week, the Health Ministry announced the re-emergence of the virus in Nzere in the southeast of the country. The World Health Organization has reported 7 cases, including 5 deaths. 4 of those deaths are probable and 1 is confirmed. CGTN's Joy Kiruki Juma brings us the latest.
A team of experts was dispatched to the affected area immediately after the virus outbreak was announced in Nzere. Samples collected from the area and taken for analysis in laboratories in the capital Conakry confirmed the worst. The country was once again facing a new wave of the Ebola virus.
There will be a fact-finding mission sent to demarcate the area that is incriminated and the villages of all the people who took part in the burial ceremony in order to identify contacts and isolate them. Afterwards, there will be a second mission that will take some time to be able to provide the answer to the source of this new outbreak. This mission will seek to find out whether it is an old disease that has awakened in the body of the patient or whether it is from wild animals such as bats that are incriminated in the genesis. We also made contact with the WHO. This time we are going to use our fatal weapon against Ebola, which is vaccination.
The World Health Organization is sending 11,000 doses of Ebola vaccines to Guinea.
Support will be deployed across all pillars of the response, including coordination, care and support, infection prevention and control, surveillance, community engagement, risk communication, logistics, human resources and finance. We will rapidly deploy capacity to support Guinea, which already has much more experience.
Nearly 11,300 people died in the Ebola epidemic that gripped Guinea between 2013 and 2016. The deadly virus has re-emerged as the country struggles to contain COVID-19. Health experts say the new outbreak is likely to impact ongoing efforts against the coronavirus.
This impact can be seen through the psychological state of the affected populations in Nzere Kure and through the general concern of Guineans about this very dangerous Ebola epidemic. In addition to the psychosocial impact, the resurgence of Ebola will impact the country's economy as the government will spend more money. The National Health Security Agency is also obliged to carry out additional site-oriented strategies, and all these activities and equipment are expensive.
Growing concern continues to plague the residents of Conakry as the country ramps up its Ebola response.
When the virus appeared in 2014, things were not easy, especially for us who live in the interior of the country. Every day there were deaths, which is why we are worried.
I am very worried, and I hope that the government will immediately take every adequate measure to circumscribe the second wave in the Nzerekure area so that the virus does not spread throughout the entire territory as it did in the first time.
Guinea's health ministry said all confirmed cases had been isolated. These reported cases of Ebola virus are the first in West Africa since 2016. Joy Kiruki Juma, CGTN.
Well, Dr. Maury Keita is the incident manager for Ebola outbreak in Guinea, based in Conakry. She's joining us now for more. Dr. Keita, thank you for joining us on Africa Live. Could you start by giving us a brief on the status of Ebola vaccinations in the country?
Thank you so much. About the vaccination, I think now we have already trained local team. We have already deployed some supervisor in the region, but we are waiting for the vaccine. Today we will receive the vaccine at the airport. So the vaccine will be sent to Nzerekure tomorrow. I will be on the flight and with the WR and with the some colleagues with the Ministry of Health.
So how is Guinea and the region in general, though, prepared to deal with any new Ebola cases?
For this new EVD outbreak, it should be mentioned that Guinea is a little bit prepared to respond to this outbreak. But in terms of preparedness at the region level, WHO has already sent a checklist to assess capacity and preparedness in neighboring countries and has already released 1.25 million to support response in Guinea and preparedness. In addition, great progress has been made since 2014 EVD outbreak in West Africa. WHO has supported the scaling up of integrated disease surveillance and response throughout the African region. We are now in the process to document the status, best practices, and lessons learned to enhance health security in African region. Regarding international health regulation core capacity, it should be mentioned that most of the countries in the African region have carried out the joint external evaluation and action plan have been developed. So today I can say that the African region is better prepared than 2014 EVD outbreak in West Africa.
So there is another public health crisis ongoing, the COVID-19 pandemic. How is Guinea going about or coping with the new Ebola cases in the middle of another pandemic?
Absolutely. As you might know, the context of COVID-19 pandemic is having an impact on any intervention in Guinea and around the African region. The EVD outbreak will not be an exception. However, contrary to other regions, the African region is dealing with more than 100 public health events annually. As a result of these challenges, I think some capacity have been developed. Even now, Guinea is dealing with yellow fever, with measles, with COVID-19 and Ebola, with the support from all the partners, including WHO and NGOs, I think we will support the country to respond to this new event.
Dr. Mori Keita joining us there from Conakry in Guinea. Thank you. Iran's foreign minister says that Iran has nothing to hide and is not seeking nuclear weapons. The statement comes as the director of the International Atomic Energy Agency meets with Iranian nuclear officials in Tehran. Iran says it is considering a European Union proposal for an informal meeting between current members of the 2015 nuclear deal and the United States. On Thursday, U.S. President Joe Biden offered to restart talks, but is demanding to see changes from Tehran before he lifts sanctions. While signs of easing nuclear tensions have come in recent days after the Biden administration signaled willingness to re-engage in talks with Tehran, Gao Yiming gives us a quick recap.
Just 2 weeks ago, U.S. President Joe Biden insisted on a tough stance on Iran. He indicated Tehran would need to first stop nuclear provocations, a precondition for lifting sanctions and resuming negotiations. But on Thursday, a subtle change of attitude following Secretary of State Antony Blinken's video conference with 3 major European signatories to the pact. Washington then said it's ready to talk to Tehran about both nations returning to the agreement. But Iran has made it clear that trust is an issue.
We have heard many nice words and promises which in practice have been broken and opposite actions have been taken. Words and promises are no good. This time we want only action from the other side, and we will also act.
Earlier this month, Iran's foreign minister said it's open to the EU playing a role to bring back Washington to the negotiating table. Washington also reaffirmed that it needs solid support from its allies to deal with the issue.
We must also address Iran's destabilizing activities across the Middle East. And we're going to work in close cooperation with our European and other partners as we proceed.
Another key party to the 2015 pact, China, said the U.S. must pick up the deal it abandoned nearly 3 years ago, and Iran should also observe its commitments.
All sides should push the United States to return unconditionally to the Iran nuclear deal and lift all of its sanctions. Iran should resume the fulfillment of all nuclear commitments. We should all keep calm and restrained to avoid the escalation of tensions and make room for diplomacy.
The White House has eased travel restrictions on Iranian diplomats posted to the United Nations. It also said it's willing to engage in the informal P5+1 meeting proposed by the EU. But the U.S. has made it clear no additional actions will be taken before any talks with Tehran and major powers about returning to the deal. Gao Yiming, CGTN.
To Myanmar now, where thousands are back on the streets across the country in protests against the military. On Saturday, 2 protesters were shot dead in the second largest city, Mandalay. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres condemned what he called the use of deadly violence. Near daily protests have rocked Myanmar since the military takeover on February the 1st. Protesters are demanding the release of detained civilian leaders, including Aung San Suu Kyi. In the main city of Yangon, several thousand young people gathered to chant slogans. Gao Jiayi filed this report from there.
According to local media, 2 people were killed and about 2 others were injured in Myanmar's second-largest city, Mandalay, on Saturday, as police and soldiers opened fire to disperse the protesters. Dozens of others were also arrested. At a shipyard in Mandalay, the police wanted the workers who joined the demonstrations go back to work. The protesters formed a wall to confront the police, and the police first cleared the site with tear gas and then fed rubber bullets and before firing live ammunition. One protester was shot in the head and the other was shot in the chest. They both died hours later. Protests across Myanmar has lasted for 15 days, and the demonstrators are demanding the restoration of the elected government and the release of Aung San Suu Kyi and others. They are urging civil servants, doctors, lawyers, and other people to join the civil disobedience movement and put pressure on the military. Even large protests are expected on Monday Shopping malls, hospitals, and the supermarkets will be closed. Yi from CGTN, Yangon.
Let's now take a look at your business news today. Here's what's up. Nigeria adjusts borrowing limits from 25% to 40% of its GDP. And the price of goods and freight containers soar in Kenya amid COVID-19.
It's just taken me completely out of my depth, but at the same time it's exciting. It's new, it's different, it's a challenge.
It's really exciting.
Nigeria has adjusted its borrowing limits upwards from 25% to 40% of its GDP. The country's debt management office says the adjustment is to enable the government to borrow further in order to fund the budget's deficit and other government obligations. But some experts are concerned this strategy could worsen the country's debt situation. CGTN's Deji Badmos has more on that story.
Nigeria has a serious cash crunch made worse by COVID-19 and low oil prices. The government has been borrowing massively to fund its budget. Despite the country's current debt level estimated at around $92 billion, the government wants to borrow more. It's increased its borrowing limit by raising the amount it is allowed to borrow as a proportion of its GDP from 25% to 40%. But some economic experts are against the idea.
There is almost a consensus at this time that our debt profile is already approaching a threshold that we cannot consider to be sustainable. If we look at the components of our resources, of our revenue, that we commit to debt service, it says sometimes close to 60%. If we look at the component of debt service in the budget compared to our capital allocation and other very vital budget heads, it's quite heavy. So, and we know that the capacity of the government to service debts is becoming increasingly challenging.
Nigeria is currently spending big to service its debts. In the third quarter of last year, the cost of debt servicing rose by 89%. Many fear racking up additional debts could worsen things for the country. But the government says the intended borrowing is only for the period of 2020 through 2023. It's also taking measures to shore up its revenues to ensure its obligations are met.
There's also a lot of improvement on our revenue generation. Even though we haven't gotten to where we want to be, but we have seen a steady increase in the revenue from 2018 to today, and we expect that trajectory to continue as we implement the strategic revenue and growth initiative.
Part of the new debt management strategy will also prioritize domestic borrowing over external loans. The government says it will focus more on long-term domestic instruments.
Perhaps that may make some sense because in the last 1 or 2 years, it's looking as if it's becoming cheaper to borrow domestically than to borrow externally. If you look at the yield on treasury bills, on federal government bonds, these things are around 1%, 2%, 3% at best. So it's becoming cheaper to borrow domestically than to borrow externally. And generally, in terms of managing debt, it is often easier to manage debts that are in domestic currency than debts that are in foreign currency.
The new borrowings will most certainly drive up the size of Nigeria's debt, but the government insists the country's debt level is sustainable and still within global recommended threshold. It says without the new borrowings, it will be more than challenging for it to meet its financing needs and get the country on the path of growth. Deji Badmos, CGTN, Lagos, Nigeria.
Let's turn now to logistics in Kenya, where the price of imported goods and demand for freight containers have surged amid the coronavirus pandemic. COVID-19 restrictions have also led to a backlog at the coastal port of Mombasa. CGTN's Terry Wangari has this report.
The Kenya Ports Authority says the container traffic at the port of Mombasa in 2020 is an estimated 1.36 million 20-foot equivalent units. However, with the ongoing coronavirus pandemic, there has been a drop in cleared cargo to an estimated 1.1 million 20-foot equivalent units.
On average, in one day, we handle 1,800 TEUs. 35% is for the transit countries. That's about 600 to 650 TEUs. And then the remaining 5% is 5 to 10% is for transshipment. And then the rest, about 60%, is for the local market.
Despite the rise in freight prices, there is still a huge demand for construction materials, medical supplies, and daily essentials.
Currently, it's around $5,000 for a 40-footer, which used to be around $1,900, $1,800 before the pandemic. We average receive about 1,800 to 2,000 TEUs a month imports, and we continue to receive this because the demand is there.
The coronavirus pandemic has affected the efficiency of international logistics owing to the restrictions put in place worldwide. A large number of empty containers are backlogged in some countries' ports.
The major reason is the pandemic, which made some ports and some countries go into lockdown. And because of these lockdowns, you could not get the containers out from those locations. And the shipping lines also could not call at that ports because it is not viable for them to call at a port where they cannot get their movement done. They have to discharge, they have to load.
In an attempt to curb the ongoing delays, the Kenya Ports Authority has embarked on strengthening operations to improve efficiency. This includes reduction of cargo dwell time and reorganizing planning of units. The addition of the standard gauge railway freight train and introduction of double-deck trucks has also led to a reduction in cargo detention at the ports. Terry Wangari, CGTN.
Tunisia has signed a $1.5 billion agreement with the International Islamic Trade Finance Corporation. The deal is aimed at supporting Tunisian state-owned companies and diversifying the tourism-dependent economy. From Tunis, here's Adnan Chauchi with more.
The Tunisian Ministry of Economy, Finance and Investment Support announced that the framework cooperation agreement between the government and the ITFC during the period 2021-2023 is worth $1.5 billion. Some $500 million per year will be used to finance imports of raw materials needed by public enterprises.
The first agreement is for financing of 100 million euros. It's intended to finance the natural gas needs imported by STEG for the production of electricity. The second agreement aims to finance the supply of raw materials to the Tunisian chemical group. It is worth $50 million.
ITFC Corporation Manager at the Ministry of Economy and Finance noted that the subsidy agreement was also signed. It will cover the cost of subscriptions to virtual training platforms of the National Center for Educational Technologies. The project is part of its distance learning program being implemented due to the COVID-19 pandemic.
The financing agreement will support Tunisian enterprises and the national economy during the pandemic. The ITFC offers a competitive financial package and a favorable loan repayment schedule. Tunisia's ties with the International Islamic Trade Financial Corporation, which is part of the Islamic Development Bank, dates back to 1974. The corporation has always been successful.
The ITFC announced that its financial and commercial support to Tunisia's development is part of its efforts to diversify the local economy and stimulate recovery after the impact of COVID-19.
Despite the challenges and the difficulties facing the economy, the Tunisian government is serious about striking deals which serve public interest and state-owned companies. We are trying to provide the necessary financial resources from different sources, including loans, to revive the economy.
The International Islamic Trade Finance Corporation's financing was provided to the Tunisian electricity and gas company STEC, the Tunisian Chemical Group, the Tunisian Refining Industries company STEER, and Al Fulad, the Tunisian steel company.
The ITFC provided $1.5 billion over 3 years under the framework agreement signed in 2018 to stimulate and diversify the Tunisian economy. Authorities say the new $1.5 billion financing will help access trade development programs to drive exports and promote inter-regional trade with other African and Arab countries. Adnan Shawishi, CGTN, Tunis.
Let's turn to your sports news and begin with athletics.